Of all the positions one could attain during the Middle Ages, the one least desirable was probably that of the serf. The meager serf was at the bottom of an already bleak totem pole of lower class, and didn't share in the same freedoms as their poor brethren, the peasants. Though a landowner could sell the labor of a serf, it could not, and it cannot be stressed enough, sell the serf themselves, making them technically not slaves. At one point, a whopping 75% of the medieval population was a serf. Today we're going to explore how much it sucked to be a serf. But before we get started, you lowly serfs, we order you to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know what you would do with a parcel of land. Okay, we're going surfing. In the Vaud, a canton of Switzerland, the law allowed for lords to chastise their serfs like the recommended consumption of Taco Bell while sober. Very light. The customary law said punishment could be served to a serf with or without cause, but they drew the line at torment, which was strictly forbidden. Unfortunately, their definition of torment was pretty loose. It was perfectly legal to throw a serf in prison for an indefinite amount of time, or to take all of their possessions, as one might a misbehaving toddler and their toys. But worse, and forever. In Notre Dame, it was legit legal to murder a serf should they get into an argument with the tenants. A law thankfully not extended to modern-day landlords. Take that, Mr. Roper. Since the rules were all over the place and varied substantially from region to region, lords pretty much did what they wanted to do when it came to disciplining serfs. This led to many lords acting in bad faith and skirting the rules with technicalities. For example, in Aragon, a lord could technically kill a man who killed one of his own dependents, but bloodshed was a no-no. So technically, an Aragon lord could and did dispose of serfs through starvation, thirst, or exposure to the elements, as in being tossed out during a very cold night. For a serf, life was hard. Serfs were given a tiny piece of land by the lord within the estate they were living on, which allowed them to harvest and provide food for their own family. Typically, this included just a small plot of land, around 12 acres per family, plus their own personal living quarters. And while they were able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, according to law, everything a serf owned was possession of the lord and could be taken or repurposed with no warning at any time. Serfs were responsible for building their homes and making their clothes, but technically even those tattered rags and flammable huts belonged to the lord. Even the food they harvested for their own personal groceries belonged to the lord, since he owned the land. But it's hard to say how often a lord snatched the food from a serf's harvest like they were a cartoon villain. Kind lords also probably didn't go around taking all of their serfs' possessions for fun. What's a wealthy lord going to do with a serf's little shovel after all? One of the main differences between a serf and a peasant was the ability to leave the land. Serfs were bound to the manor they served, while a peasant was free to roam around and be poor on any street of their choosing. You couldn't tie a peasant down. Think of them as serfs with wanderlust. Peasants were poverty-stricken and relied heavily on the affluent community to provide sustenance, but serfs legally had to pay taxes, rent, and other random payments to their lords. There was no general rule for what financial dues a serf was responsible for, as it varied by region. In most European countries, a serf was treated as part of the estate and came with the land. Serfs weren't seen as slaves during this era because a serf could not be purchased, but their labor could be sold, though this too varied by region. For example, in Russia, a serf was totally up for sale, much more like a slave. Some countries saw serfs as poor little babies whose only purpose in life was to tend to manors and castles until they died. But others saw an opportunity to beef up their military numbers. Russian forces in the Middle Ages were extremely dependent on serf and peasant labor, boosting the amount of soldiers to over 1 million men throughout the 19th century. State-owned peasants, as well as privately owned serfs, were bound to servitude, so this really wasn't a volunteered patriotic calling for serfs in Russia. Russia didn't have a big distinction between a serf and a peasant. A serf who was freed of serfdom would be let loose into society with no land or money, like a theater major, and probably with the same amount of job prospects. Serfs could turn to self-imposed state peasantry since it was better to be supported with some measurable degree of freedom, or like when that theater major moves back in with their parents after college. Beggars can't be choosers. It might be tradition for a man to ask a woman's father for permission to marry his daughter, but in a serf's life, he had to ask his lord before putting a ring on his bride-to-be. It might sound insane to have to double-check with one's boss before popping the question, but remember, a serf was barely considered a human, basically like permanent entry-level peons. The abbot of Upper Swabia, or what today is the modern-day German state of Bavaria, issued a number of decrees designed to oppress the Freisenser, which was a term used to describe free but census-paying tenants, as well as all serfs. The abbot focused his serf-hating energy on placing regulations on who could marry and providing consequences for people who married beneath their class. Oh sure, a serf couldn't marry someone a slight step above a serf, but fives marry tens all the time on TV shows and nobody says anything. Weird history, how Kevin James married all those hotties on TV, coming in the year 2050. If a peasant did get desperate and decide to settle for a penniless serf, half of the peasant's estate would be confiscated and the other half would be taxed to literal death, with death duties. This kept peasants and serfs humble and poor and knocked many down to an even lower class, with less hope of buying their way out of serfdom. Sounds like a pretty good excuse to never get married. Plus, did the term old maid even exist in these times? What was that? Unmarried at 20 years old? Okay. There was no such thing as calling in sick for a serf with a scratchy throat and a runny nose. That's not to say sick days didn't exist in this time. Some estates provided a set amount of sick days, normally amounting to 2 to 3 weeks throughout the year. How a sick serf was treated varied on laws of the land and what kind of mood the lord was in that day. A cruel lord could very well force his bubonic-plagued serf to work while not providing him 1 minute of sick leave. And if the illness left him incapacitated and unable to work, he could be punished, as if getting the plague wasn't bad enough. And for more information on how much the plague sucked, see some of our other weird history videos. Other manners allowed for serfs to quit all work for the day, with the exception of plowing and other random jobs that needed to be done. Usually the day of work had to be made up at some point within the year, either by himself or through a replacement. As if being a serf wasn't bad enough, serfs also had to find somebody to cover their shift at work? Eesh! A serf didn't dare say, "That's not in my job description," as their day-to-day lives encompassed a plethora of duties. The men normally stuck with most of the back-breaking agricultural chores, like plowing and mowing the fields, for a real hard day's hard. Apologies, current-day office worker. Because of the intensity of the labor, a serf's work week was a breezy 3 to 4 days. Women serfs may not have been out in the fields all day, but they didn't lack chores of their own to accomplish. Women were in charge of all the cooking, general housework, baking bread, making wool, milking and making butter and cheese, and taking care of whatever children might be in the mix. No time for wine night with the girls. However, should they have decided to have an impromptu wine and cheese night, pressing wine was part of the duties for a serf. Unfortunately, if it required a wine press, well, that came out of the serf's shallow pockets, since it was their responsibility to pay the owner of said wine press. Medieval court systems had no time for nonsense such as serf problems. So whenever a civil dispute would blow up between a serf and a fellow serf, or a serf and his lord, the issue was handled internally and not in the king's court. The aristocracy had no interest in peasant justice, so they passed along the power of the courts to lords, giving them power to operate their own manor court. It's probably no surprise that this was not exactly weighted in the serf's favor. If the issue being challenged was between the serf and the lord, be it a monetary dispute, alleged dicey work ethic, or unreasonable conditions for the serf, it was not likely that the judge, the lord accused, would rule against himself. This was a real bummer for serfs, since the lord also had the power to take generous liberties with their interpretation of the laws to curb it to their own favor. One of the 2 to 3 benefits of being a serf included having a place to live. Serfs usually lived alone or with their families, but serfs bunking with fellow random serfs like a dorm room was not common. Their housing varied from region to region, but the most common was a hut with a thatched roof or a roof comprised of dried vegetation, which sounds extremely safe. The hut itself was typically made of wood with 1 or 2 rooms and dirt floors. In the center of the hut was a hearth for cooking, complete with a state-of-the-art hole in the ceiling for smoke to ventilate. Unfortunately, this did not take into account the dried vegetation being used on the roof, famously flammable. So sure enough, these huts were known to catch on fire. While most people would see something like the Black Plague as something of a disadvantage to staying alive, serfs saw it as more of an opportunity to flee for a better life. During times of upheaval or societal chaos, of which there were many in the Middle Ages, some serfs would take advantage and quietly slip out into the night to towns far away from their lords, successfully leaving their serfdom behind. This decision did not come without risk. Serfs might have left when foot traffic was light in the streets of a plague-infected Europe, but that did not make them immune to catching the plague themselves. They were also vulnerable to attack since they were freely traveling without supervision, like a bunch of children let loose in a museum on a field trip. Where is that chaperone? Getting caught was probably the riskiest gamble since punishment would be severe if captured and returned back to an angry lord in a now unkempt castle. The lord wasn't trying to plow his own fields or tend to his own chickens like some kind of grody poor person. Much like the movie The Irishman, serfdom took its time to come to an end. When and where serfdom came to an end, much like the plot of The Irishman, was all over the place. Normandy experienced the Peasants' Revolt in 996, which pretty much was a series wrap on serfdom in Normandy. England was soon to follow, a short little 385 years later in 1381, when their own peasants also said, "Screw this," and had their own uprising. The few stragglers that remained in the following century were free in 1574, when Queen Elizabeth I said, "This is nonsense," and formally abolished the practice of serfdom. Even so, a lot of places dragged their heels a bit in freeing their serfs, but for the most part, the widespread use of serfs was donezo by the end of the 14th century. A trickling of serf-like practices remained until the early 20th century in the UK under a copyhold tenancy holdover. Being a serf sucked, that much is pretty clear. But it also paved the way for some really ugly times in American history when early colonizers viewed this system as a way to receive free labor in the form of slavery. From the 14th century on, it was fairly understood that serfdom wasn't cool and fell out of favor when the New World was first colonized. Regions that were still using serfs for labor had the revelation they could make a killing overseas if they outsourced their labor. The servants they brought with them resembled a serf in that they were indentured servants who had the opportunity to pay for their freedom. But colonizers soon came to the monstrous conclusion they didn't have to offer a price for freedom if they imported free labor from Africa. Thus began a grim chapter in the American history books where involuntary and lifelong slavery became the gold standard of labor. So what do you think? Do rich people always win? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.